My name is Nirmala Perera and I'm your host. We thank you for joining us today. This podcast series hosts a wide variety of brilliant minds around the world that are working at the forefront of COVID-19 and sport. Our objective for the podcast series is to invite leaders to talk about a wide range of topics, to foster learning, inspiration, and innovation, and provoke conversations that can dictate the future of sport and exercise medicine. So give us a like, follow us on our social media channels, and stay informed. Today, we welcome Dr. Andrew Murray and Dr. Sean Carmody.
Thank you, Nim.
Thank you very much, Nim. Thanks for having me.
So Andrew and Sean, both of you are sports persons. Can you tell us a little bit about how it all started for you, Andrew?
Yes, my sports medicine career actually came about by accident. I was running 2,660 miles from John O'Groats in far north Scotland to the Sahara Desert. And during the course of that run, I actually started to think a bit about sports medicine and start to think about the sheer benefits of physical activity for health. I remember reading an editorial by Manos Stamatakis and by Richard Wheeler that talked about, the sheer scale of benefits for physical activity, with the longevity, the physical health benefits, the mental health benefits, the emotional and social benefits. And just thought, as a day-to-day general practitioner, I'd been talking too much about giving people medication, arranging rescue helicopters, and all the things that are dramatic and also can make a difference. But I hadn't really done enough to promote physical activity for health, or healthy eating, or these other things that are equally as important. So from sitting in the camper van, because I was running about 35 miles a day, I'd do my running, I would then do some reading, and from that point, essentially I learned a bit more about sports medicine. And by the time I reached the Sahara, they actually made a documentary for the BBC about it. And when I got home, the Minister for Sport and the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland invited me to do some work on physical activity for health, because I've been talking a fair bit about it in the various fora that we had. So it was by accident, but it's been great fun since then. And I think the beauty of sports medicine is how broad it is. I'm still absolutely passionate about the benefits of physical activity for health, but also about being able to prevent and treat illness, prevent and treat injury, and then also contribute to performance for our athletes.
Thanks for that, Andrew. And Sean, you're also an elite athlete. You represent Ireland in rugby league. Can you tell us a little bit about your sporting career and how you got into sport medicine?
I think my story is a little bit less interesting than Andrew's. Unfortunately, I didn't have any documentary crew following me, but I might be reluctant to call myself elite. I was fortunate in the sense that there are two rugby codes in Ireland, rugby league and rugby union, and rugby union is very much the dominant code. I played rugby league, and not many others played rugby league. So by sheer fact of that, there weren't very many players, I managed to get a few international caps. My main talent was the fact that I kind of turned up on time and I had a good attitude. I certainly wouldn't say I was strong enough or fast enough to call myself elite. But I guess, my interest in sports medicine stemmed from a love of sport and a great desire to be involved in sport, especially competitive sport. And that's really what's been my main driver.
Yeah, great. Can you also just touch up on some of the key choices that you made, and if you have any tips for people who wants to get into work in high performance and professional sport?
I think from my perspective, the key choices you take will be different for each person, but never miss an opportunity. There are so many things out there. And I think I've always been fortunate to have good mentors and people like Roger Hawkes and James Robson and Alistair Nicholl in the UK, and people such as, Karim Khan internationally. And they've been brilliant in looking for opportunities and signposting them. And I think partly it can be, as Karim says, strategically volunteering, putting yourself forward and trying to add value, or trying to do the things that you feel that you can do that might contribute to the sports medicine team. And I think if I had tips for anyone, it's really just to keep your eyes open and to look out for opportunities that might work, either now or further down the line. And the likes of Sean is a great example of someone that constantly adds value to a project, as do you, Nim, in terms of just working out how you can contribute most strongly. Be that in terms of operationally or strategically or from a research perspective. It's great the diversity we have in sports medicine.
What about you, Sean?
Well, I guess I'm very much in the early stages of my career, very much still in the development stage. And as I kind of maybe progress a little bit, becoming much more acutely aware of the limitations I have. I guess, you know, I was fortunate to have a good education, and was very lucky in lots of respects. But I hope, you know, as I went on, I had done some of the work to take the opportunities when they come up. And you know, as Andrew mentioned, I think having good mentors has been very important, and I'm fortunate that Andrew's been a very good mentor to me, and the likes of Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed. So you know, for me, they're kind of the things that have really helped me to get to where I am. I think it's always, as Andrew mentioned, important to try and always to add value. I mean, for a doctor or a medical student in the early stages of their career, they definitely do have skills that can add value, even though they might not think it, whether that's, you know, using social media to share important messages, or you know, developing infographics. Even something now, you know, I wouldn't consider myself old, but I have no idea, you know, what TikTok is. But, you know, how could we use TikTok to share important messages about sports medicine and physical activity? So that, you know, there always are opportunities to add value.
Thank you, Sean. I think now let's shift our focus to the paper that you published, both of you published in BJSM, about the risk assessment and factors to consider on safety recommencing sport. Because COVID-19 shifted the finish line for many, and now we are emerging from lockdown, and sport is back, and it is really important that we recommence or restart sports safely. So firstly, can you highlight 5 key factors WHO used to determine risk?
I'll start off here. I think for this paper, we're very fortunate to have some great input from experts at the World Health Organization, both in their mass gatherings unit, but also their physical activity and sport. So thanks to Fiona Bull and Tamircio Barbeshi for the leadership there. We also had some really good input from the likes of the UK, so the English and the Scottish governments, to try and work out how things matter from a policy perspective and what's practical, because it's easy for us to look at the theory, but the practical application of it's really important. And then the author group included Andy Massey, the Chief Medical Officer for FIFA, Vincent Gutera, who's representing the athletes, and Sean, who again led this whole process, and I was able to contribute to that as well. But what it showed is there are certain factors that we need to consider, and they can strongly influence the level of risk that sporting events are subject to. So number one, will the event be held in a country that has documented active local transmission of COVID-19? So at present, people are a good deal more able to do things in New Zealand than they would be, for example, in Brazil, in the UK. And that's because local transmission has been so well controlled. The second thing is, will the event be held in multiple venues or cities? So again, if you've got one base that you can create a controlled environment, it's a good deal more straightforward than if there's multiple loci and multiple areas that you're looking to control. Will the event include international participants from countries that have got documented local transmission? So again, if you've got an event that's taking place in Australia or in Ireland or in the UK with only local participants, you're taking out some key factors, including air transfer, air transport, people having to come from other countries where local transmission might be greater, and even the accommodation requirement can alter risk, etc. I think also just thinking about risk stratification, we know that COVID can have profound effects on everybody, but is a far more severe disease on average for older adults, so those over 65, and also those with underlying health conditions. So risk stratifying and thinking if the event does involve a significant number of participants at higher risk of COVID. Also thinking about the nature of the sport or the nature of the mass gathering. Will the event include sports that are considered at higher risk for COVID-19? And I'm involved in a number of sports and love them all in terms of football, rugby, golf, etc. But you can see that the contact element of rugby, for example, would be greater than the contact element of golf. And also thinking about, will the event be held indoors or outdoors? The risk of transmission of COVID outdoors is a good deal less than it is indoors. So just other factors to consider. And none of these in isolation makes your decision for you, but they can all contribute strongly to how things are. And probably the strongest of these factors is, will the event be held in a country that has documented transmission? And what is the level of the local transmission? As we see COVID is a rapidly evolving issue and is very significantly affecting every country on earth, but some more unequally than others at present.
I think that's a good segue to see how we can apply some of these key factors to some practical examples. Maybe I'll throw this one to you, Sean. Can you talk us through some of the key consideration if I am organizing a team sport, for example, let's say rugby, in a country with low transmission?
Well, one of the conversations we had when we were obviously building on the WHO guide, on the World Health Organization guidance, and having conversations, around particular sports. Obviously, some sports are more higher risk than others. For example, golf by nature is a naturally social sport. A sport like rugby, where there's a much more contact exposures, well, that's much more high risk. But if you are in a country where New Zealand, which has obviously managed things very well and has a very low number of cases, and in fact I think at the moment has essentially 0 cases, well then you can think about getting back to playing sport under certain having enhanced hygiene measures and possibly behind closed doors, although in New Zealand we did see actually there were some fans present as well, and that's perhaps just reflective of how few cases there were in the country. And I think ultimately it gave hope to the rest of the world when we saw the competition coming back in New Zealand, because sport is very important for people, and it maybe perhaps reflected that at the early stages of recovery.
Yeah, and if we are staging a rugby match in, let's say, in Edinburgh, for example, Andrew, like what are some of the considerations?
Yeah, great point. And again, the context will depend on what WHO recommendations are, but also what your national government and the Public Health Authority are saying. So I know your group's produced some brilliant recommendations in Australia that are applicable and have inspired what folk are doing in different parts of the world. But for rugby matches in Edinburgh, Scottish Rugby have been collaborating with Health Protection Scotland, so our Public Health Authority, and collaborating with the national government, and that's really important. And 9 big things that we're looking to do for rugby in Edinburgh would be, number 1, an accurate risk assessment and consideration of the control measures that we could put in place. So what can go wrong and what can we do about it, but also thinking about the benefits of the sport and the benefits of the spectator experience in terms of socially, economically, and wider as well. Number 2, enhanced standards of hygiene and hand washing at all times. So important. We know that the disease does not like hand washing, so the more we can do of that, the better, and for at least 20 seconds at a time. And that's for everyone. Thirdly, athlete and staff education. So Scottish Rugby are going to produce mandatory education for athletes and for staff, specifically on COVID-19. What are the disease processes? What are the symptoms and the signs that you can get from it? And what can we do about it? What are the concrete actions you can take to decrease the risk of COVID? So staff and athlete education there. Fourth, minimise the number of persons on site or at the event. So thinking about what are the minimum number of people that you can have on site to safely proceed. And if you look at the English Premier League, they've got 300 on site to safely proceed. If you look at the European Tour Golf, we tend to have about 500 on site because our player numbers are very big. If you look at all different sports, the answers will be different for different scales of participants. But just thinking while COVID is with us about minimising numbers, and that's why you're seeing the behind closed doors scenario and looking to increase things just as things become a bit safer. Fifth, minimise those of the highest risk. We know that COVID disproportionately affects those that are over 65 years old and with predisposing health conditions. So decreasing the number of people that would be in increased risk on site. Sixth, try and choose a location with low prevalence or transmission of COVID-19. So again, if there were different areas of Scotland that had different areas of transmission, we would more likely look to host matches in areas with lower transmission. And again, you can see, as Sean highlights, that's why New Zealand are having success in getting back to sport, because the prevalence and the transmission of COVID-19 is very low in New Zealand. And Australia are having some good success overall as well. The other thing is minimising travel from and through locations with transmission of COVID-19. So working for the European Tour, working with Scottish Rugby or other partners, when the UK was at the height of the epidemic, then it would have been most unwise for us to try and send our athletes to areas of lower transmission, because that could seed and plant, COVID from our location to theirs. So just thinking about minimising travel through locations with transmission of COVID-19. So we're probably less likely to play Brazil at rugby this month than we would potentially consider other opposition. And also thinking about the availability of screening. So daily asking about symptoms. Have you got a new continuous cough? Have you got new shortness of breath? Have you got a fever? And have you potentially the opportunity also to take a daily temperature reading from people? I think the other thing is availability of testing. If the national infrastructure has sufficient testing, that can be very supportive of major sporting events. But again, it's about trying to avoid how you're impinging as to PPE requirements, or how you're avoiding stealing testing requirements to the national health provider. So consideration of private testing, should that be helpful as well. And the other thing that's absolutely critical that we know about COVID is contact tracing and isolation of those with the disease is so important. So thinking about those 9 factors has been really useful for our understanding. And again, as a figure in the editorial that we wrote, which is Carmody et al., thinking about return to sporting events from the BJSM.
So team sports, contact sports probably have higher risk. But if we shift focus a little bit and look at individual sports, how can we apply this risk assessment to individual sports, and what are some of the considerations? Because the risk of transmission might be lower in an individual sport. But then again, we heard about recently there was a issue with tennis that the players were infected.
Yeah, I'll pick that one up just because we use individual sports and I work within professional golf. And actually, I think that largely the same things apply. So it's about working out with the national government and with the Public Health Authority what is a reasonable risk assessment and what are the control measures that you can put in place. But really, it comes down to the same factors, really. And if you think about the events where things have gone wrong, or if you think about the events that things have gone right, and you can see, again, it comes down to the risk assessment and putting control measures in place to decrease risk. It's about enhanced standards of hygiene and hand washing. It's about social distancing as able. It's about athlete and staff education. It's about minimising the number of persons on site. It's about trying to choose locations with low prevalence and transmission of the disease. It's about having the availability of testing and contact tracing appropriately and rapidly. So really, I'm a fairly boring man, and I'll say the same thing as per my last answer, but many of the same factors apply to individual sports as to team sports. But then you can also make individual changes, like, for example, rugby are thinking of changing some laws, and for example, in golf, we're washing the flagstick after every individual has used a golf hole, etc. So there are general considerations and the specific things for each sport. And of course, with tennis, it might be about thinking about the format of sport. It might be about thinking about the use of balls. It might be thinking of how ball boys are interacting. And again, Babette Plume and Todd Ellenbecker, our colleagues at the ATP, have done a fantastic job on tennis. And I think that the ATP will be in a really good place when the professional sporting events that are organised by these organisations return.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Andrew. And I think that you made a really important point that the individual sports and team sports, like, you still have the risk. So it's important to be aware and be vigilant at all times and take the general hygiene measures and things like that to mitigate that risk.
It really is a really nasty virus. And
yeah,
if you do that consistently right, there's a good chance that essentially things can progress. If you don't, there's absolutely every chance that catastrophes will occur.
I know, Nim, you also mentioned about the challenges with the tournament that took place in Croatia. Ross Tucker does a very good podcast on that, where he goes into depth about, maybe some of the factors that Andrew mentioned that are really important weren't necessarily considered there. So that might be something for people to listen to.
Yeah, wonderful. Just before we wrap up, both of you are working in sport now, and the sport has restarted. So some of the lessons you've learned so far from your experience.
From my own perspective, Nim, it's about, I suppose, recognising that the science is starting to grow on this. So there's been some great work that you led with David Hughes from the Australian Institute of Sport that inspired what we did in the UK. But again, there's lots of scientists and lots of research that's moving at pace and scale. So trying to keep up to date with what's going on can be really helpful, and it can be a confusing world. But I suppose just taking time to reflect, 'cause this is absolutely not in the usual world. So I think proceeding with events without a clear understanding of exactly what we can do to control risks is really difficult at present. So I'd say that it's a time that we need to sit and reflect and read and think very carefully about what we're doing and do absolutely everything we can to minimise risk. Because something that our Chief Medical Officer in Scotland said, and I think is absolutely right, is anything we do in advance will seem like overkill. And everything that we do in retrospect will seem as if we haven't done enough. And I think that still applies, is we really need to be aware of the fact that COVID is a pandemic that is going to further escalate. We are seeing further rises in cases in South America, in parts of Asia. We're very likely to see a rapid escalation in Africa at some point in the near future. So I think it's recognising that this will be an issue that's with us for 2020 and for 2021, and that ongoing care and attention is really important.
Any final words from your end, Sean?
Well, just to say, just to build on what Andrew said, and I guess, you know, it is going to be an exceptionally challenging time for everyone. And ultimately, you know, as doctors, I guess it's you know, we're in a position where we're able to work and help. And I think while it's going to be hugely challenging, I guess the last thing we have control over is controlling our attitude towards it and trying to do the right thing and trying to be helpful, trying to be positive where we can, and do things safely to minimise the impact of COVID.
I think we will wrap it up there. And thanks both Sean and Andrew for joining us today.
Thanks, Tim. A real pleasure catching up, and keep up the brilliant work. And likewise, Sean, we'll hopefully catch up soon.
Thank you, Nim and Andrew. Thank you very much for having us. Thanks.
Also, a very special thanks to our audience for joining us today. If you missed this podcast, you can now watch the replay on Twitter, Facebook, or on YouTube, and listen to the audio in our SoundCloud account. Please forward this to anyone you think would gain value from watching it. You can also suggest podcast topics and guests. Give us a like and a follow, and stay in touch via our social media channels. Look out for our next podcast, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.